Welcome, everyone. We're going to try to get started here, so if you want to file in the room. And it's such a great networking event that we only have one speaker present currently. Of an announcement, if there's any legislators in the room, there will be a legislators meeting in the Marquee Room A on the 9th floor. So if there's any legislators, Marquee Room A, 9th floor at 6:30 tonight. All right. And I was thinking too, so, while we're trying to let other people come up here that are supposed to be speaking, that I'd tell you something in terms of being from Minnesota. Minnesota is run by land of many liberals. We had an interesting thing happen that many of you might have heard, and people from overseas maybe not, but we had a 35W, or one of our major bridges, fall down during rush hour traffic. And how does that relate to global warming? Because we actually had a legislator that was in the news stating that she was not going to rule out global warming as a cause for that bridge to fall down. So we can get way off the beaten track in Minnesota and try to blame global warming on darn near everything. Well, first up today, or this session, is Anthony Watts. Again, when I'm a moderator, I like to just give you just a snippet. Anthony says that most of you should know these speakers, so we should. And if you don't, we'll read the bios. You can read the whole bio yourself. But Anthony is a 25-year broadcast meteorology veteran and currently chief meteorologist for KPAY AM radio. He got his start as an on-air meteorologist for WLFI TV in Lafayette, Indiana, and at KHSL TV in Chico, California. In 1987, he founded IT Works, which supplies broadcast graphic systems to hundreds of cable television and radio stations nationwide. So let's welcome Anthony.
There we go. Thanks for being here, everybody. Today I'm going to talk about the Weather and Climate Measurement Network in the United States. Those of you that have followed my blog and my Surface Stations project probably know what to expect. Some of these pictures, some of the data you've seen before, but there's also some new things in here. What I want to first just do as a quick intro, because I want to save some time, is tell you how this happened. And it truly is a case of serendipity. Back in 2006, after leaving television in 2002, I had gotten elected to the local school board. And then in 2006, I got de-elected from the local school board. I had time on my hands. And one of the things I wondered about then was something that went all the way back to my college days. One of my first jobs as a college student in the meteorology department was to put together a weather station. And one day this box arrived, and the professor says, "Put this together for me, will you?" Okay. I unpacked it, and it's all these boards. And it was a Stevenson Screen. Okay, I can do that. And I started taking it apart, and I noticed that this paint was coming off in my hands. What is this? I went to my professor and said, "Hey, what's the deal? This thing is like sub-quality workmanship. All this paint's coming off in my hand." And he says, "Oh, that's whitewash." And I says, "Well, can I repaint that? Because this is just awful." And he says, "No, don't touch it. It has a very specific infrared characteristic, and if you change the paint, it'll change the temperature in the station." Okay, I get that. I'd always remembered that, and I'd wondered about it, because in 1979, the Weather Service changed their specification from whitewash to latex. And so I decided I better check this out. I had some time. I could do this finally. And I went around looking to see if, in fact, they had been changed. And that's what got me started on this project. I started looking at paint, and I found other things. The very first USHCN, U.S. Historical Climatological Network station I visited was in the town I lived in, Chico, California. This was at the Chico State University farm. And the shelter had been repainted with latex. Everything was good there. I figured I'd take a look inside. And then I discovered, wait a minute, there's an electronic temperature sensor there and a radio transmitter, but the temperature sensor and the radio transmitter are just 6 inches away from each other. Who does that? Who puts in electronics make heat next to the temperature sensor? I figured it was just somebody who wasn't thinking clear. So I went on to another station. This one was in Orland, California. And everything looked normal there. It had the standard mercury thermometers. It was well-sighted. It had well-maintained appearance. Everything looked good. So I figured the whole thing with the other one was just a fluke. And then I stumbled across Marysville, California. And this one I had a little trouble assimilating because it just didn't make sense to me at first. This was the first exposure I had to this special kind of sensor, this thing that looked like the stacked dinner plates there. That's called an MMTS. stands for Maximum Minimum Temperature System. Some of the Met techs I talked to in the National Weather Service call it the Mickey Mouse temperature system. They have some aspersion to it. Anyway, I was standing there photographing this thing. One of the angles I photographed you don't see here, I was standing next to the hedge there, and I could feel this warm air blowing on me from the air conditioners. As you see, the city had put up a cell phone tower, and they wanted to lease out that space, so they had to put in these electronic buildings for the cell phone system. And so hot air, warm air was blowing on me, and at the same time I noticed that it was right in the middle of a parking lot. The fire chief would pull his vehicle right up next to it, and so we had parking within inches of a temperature sensor. It just didn't make sense. 2 out of 3 now that I'd looked at had problems, so I started asking around. And I decided I'd download some temperature data and take a look, and sure enough, Orland and Marysville had differences. When you plot them out, they had different scales. Or not different scales, but different trends of temperature over the same scale. So obviously something was amiss. Started asking around some more. You guys know where there are some other weather stations I can look at. Found one at the National Weather Service in Monterey. This one is also near a parking lot, and it's over cinder block or crushed cinder stone. And then I found one in Woodland, California, not part of the USHCN, a regular co-op station, but it was measuring the temperature at a parking lot. And so I started asking around some more. I started talking with Dr. Roger Pielke Sr. at the University of Colorado. I asked him about this because I had found a study he'd done in Colorado looking at weather stations and siting. And we came to the realization after talking that there was no database that dealt with this issue of microsite biases and things that have built up around stations and poorly sited stations and so forth. So after talking with Pielke, I decided, you know what, we should put the database together. And so that's what I did. And in 2007, in the summer, I started the surfacestations.org project, put together a website, and started talking about it on blogs, one of which was Steve McIntyre's Climate Audit. He did me a tremendous service in helping me expose the need for this and getting volunteers going. And if it wasn't for Steve, I probably would not have got this going to the point that it was. So I owe him a great debt. So here's some examples of some of the things we found. And these are all from photographs that I've done, and I've done over 100 stations myself, and we've had volunteers, some of which have done single stations, others have done upwards to as many as 50 to 100 stations. We find that a lot of the stations have been put together in such a way that it's more convenient for the observer so that they don't have to maintain it so much. They don't want to have to deal with weeds, so they put down things like gravel and weed mat. This guy didn't like getting his feet dirty, so he put down rubber mats, black rubber mats under the Stevenson screens and other things. This is a picture that George Taylor took in Dayton, Washington. I recently visited this station again, and it's exactly the same. It looks identical, right over cinder and gravel mixture. Wairika, California. This one is over crushed rough cinders, volcanic cinders. It was recently moved and converted to an MMTS and moved even closer to the building. One was over weed chips, or not weed chips, but weed mat and wood chips in Redding, California. And I never thought that would be hot until I walked on it, and I discovered that this is quite hot. It doesn't look like it would be, but it is. You can feel it. You can measure it. One of our volunteers, Russ Steele, went up into the mountains near Tahoe and got this at Lake Spalding, and he found an MMTS that had been put on the side of a tower. We think the boat is there in case of catastrophic sea level rise. Here's where it used to be. This was the station previously. Cooler environment, wouldn't you think? The reason it got moved was vandalism. This was in a place where they couldn't watch it, and people were tearing up the weather station, so they moved it to a warmer place. One of the biggest surprises I had, you know, I've been in meteorology in 30 years, and the last thing I ever expected to find that we'd be measuring climate at sewage treatment plants. But we do. There's about 70 stations in the network of 1,221 at sewage treatment plants. Interesting thing about sewage treatment plants is that they generate heat as part of the digestion process. This particular Stevenson screen is right next to a vent, that little round object to the back of it there. That is an air vent. There's an underground tank there. We find other stations at sewage treatment plants, some of which have nice high reflective albedo things around them. Some of them would be well sited if it weren't at a sewage treatment plant. We find them in places where they're near the open vats, where things are growing on the sensors. I don't know if you can see it in this picture or not, but that sensor is discolored. It's got mold and soot and so forth on it. This one was one of the early stations where we said, what were they thinking? The MMTS is mounted on the brick wall in kind of a U-shaped alcove. And there's these vents that you see there, the plant effluent entrance. That's where the raw sewage comes in. And then there's this refrigeration unit over to the left side. And I asked, why is that there? And they said, well, in the summer it's too hot for the guys to work out there, so we put this thing in there to blow cool air. I kid you not. This one is at the sewage treatment plant that services Cape Canaveral. It's right next to the tank. Digestion tank makes heat. I wondered, what do those digestion tanks do when they're operating? This picture taken in Ontario, Oregon, I took this from a highway overpass at great personal risk, and I took this photo because I could see the steam coming off of these tanks. The air temperature at this time was 0 degrees centigrade, 32 Fahrenheit. And as you can see, those two digestion tanks have quite a bit of heat in them. Now imagine an MMTS sensor being mounted next to that. Do you think it would read higher? I think it would. We found them at other sewage treatment plants next to incinerators, and there's an open sewage valve right next to it there. This kind of sighting was fairly regular. And where there is moisture and stuff in the air, things grow. As you can see, this one's got a nice patch of algae on it. There's another sewage treatment plant that has one too. We found that MMTSs are getting discolored on a regular basis, or they're having things growing on them throughout the network, and these are not being cleaned or maintained regularly. We found that some stations are mounted directly over concrete pads, and I'd point out that the National Weather Service has a simple rule, the 100-foot rule, which they publish on their webpage, that says any temperature sensor should be at least 100 feet away from objects that might bias it, such as asphalt, concrete, automobiles, buildings, and so forth. Here we have one in Paso Robles on a concrete pad, and it's right next to the Highway 101 interchange. You can see the Highway 101 sign there, urbanization in progress. More concrete pads, and more. We found a lot of stations at airports, small airports that were not converted to automatic stations, were very close to the tarmac. This one here, they had a problem with something with the cable, so they pulled up the thing, and they then couldn't rebury the cable for some reason, so they just strapped it to the deck. Some of the MMTSs are shorter than regulation. They're supposed to be a standard measurement height, and that measurement height is often not adhered to. This one here is almost as short as the hedge. It's also fairly close to a building and a sidewalk. We found a lot of MMTS sensors getting closer to buildings and closer to air conditioners. It had to do with the cabling. Whereas Stevenson Screens in the past could be placed anywhere, the MMTSs had to have a cable, and sometimes the guy that they send out to do this, the Weather Service technician, has an afternoon, a shovel, and a pickaxe, and that's all he's got. And so when he comes up against a barrier like a sidewalk or something, he can't get past it. He can't put the sensor where it used to be. And so they tend to get closer to buildings, we found. And then in other cases, landscaping kicks in, like this one here. It's closer to the building, and they put down cinder rock to make it look nice and not have to worry about the weeds. This one here, we don't know why they couldn't just move it out a few feet. Maybe they just ran out of time. Even in the middle of nowhere, literally, Hay Springs, Nebraska, you'd think with all that open prairie out there, you could at least put it 100 feet away, but no, it's right next to the building. And then there's stations that are on the buildings. This one here at Winfield Locks, West Virginia, right on top. The reason? They wanted it in a secure place. It's secure, but it's warm. Some are not maintained well at all. We don't understand this one. This one's got brown paint or some kind of stuff all over it. The curator wasn't home when we got this photo, but a lot of stations are badly maintained. A lot of the Stevenson Screens are falling apart, just like this one. This one's from George Taylor. Here's one showing proximity to an air conditioner and an asphalt parking lot. I snapped this one in Napa, California. It's about 9 feet from the sensor to the air conditioner, next to the building, next to the parking. This picture here illustrates well how the problem of cabling kicks in. As you can see off in the distance there is a Fisher Porter rain gauge and a Stevenson Screen off in the nice grassy area. Then you see the MMTS sensor in the foreground. The problem was they couldn't get past the driveway. They couldn't trench under it. And so where do they put it? Well, most convenient place, because the sensor has to be outside and the display has to be inside. The display for these is not weatherproof, and so they have to run the cable into the building, and if you can't get the cable past the sidewalk, well, you're out of luck. We found them next to air conditioners and next to buildings. This photo here is of particular interest because it started an investigation that led somewhere where we didn't expect. This one is of Detroit Lakes, Minnesota. And this one, I originally thought, well, you know, I looked at the temperature graph, and there must be something that's causing this temperature spike around the year 2000. And I surmised that it had something to do with the air conditioners, given the proximity. And so I called the radio station engineer and asked him, well, when did those air conditioner units go in? He says, okay, let me check. And he pulls out a invoice, and he says, okay, it was in May 1999 when this went in, and then we had them all through the summer. And I said, oh, okay, must have been the air conditioners. A lot of people got upset about that. And so we started looking at it some more. Steve McIntyre here started looking at the data and said, you know, maybe it's not air conditioners, maybe it's something else. And he started looking at the data, and this is where he discovered the Y2K problem with NASA, where they missed the splicing of data between the years 1999 and 2000, and in the process created a step jump in every temperature record in the United States. And NASA had to correct it because of this station and what it led us to find. One side note to this station, you notice the Stevenson Screen there, how it's tilting? That's a swamp behind the radio station. And the reason that the Stevenson Screen is like that is because they picked it up and moved it away from the swamp. And the reason for that is because the general manager of the radio station was concerned that one day one of the observers was going to break the mercury thermometers accidentally while doing an observation, and the mercury would spill in the swamp, and then he'd have a hazmat problem on his hands. Happy Camp, California. This is in the coastal range of California, really in the middle of nowhere. I found 22 air conditioners within proximity of this station, plus a parking lot. Those air conditioners were not there in the 50s and 60s at this Forest Service office. They were an addition in the 70s. Even Weather Service offices get it wrong sometimes. This one in Eureka has shading issues, and it's right next to the parking lot for the facility, and it's got gravel down there. It's also facing the wrong direction. The Stevenson Screen door is facing south. We've got shading issues in the network, a lot of those. Things build up and grow up around them. And then, of course, we've got parking problems. Everybody's got parking problems, but there's always convenient parking next to your favorite weather station. This one here was a bafflement. Can you imagine what that might do to the temperature sensor if you parked your vehicle nose in right next to it some night? As the radiator and the engine let its heat out. This one here had not only regular parking, but a burn barrel next to it. This is another famous station done by people that should know better, the University of Arizona at Tucson. Their Stevenson Screen is in a nicely fenced-in area right on their parking lot. They claim that they did that because they had no place else to put it, and that they thought that, well, since there's so much urbanization around it, it was representative of the area. Here's another station that we found. It got moved originally from a grassy area at an observer's home to this radio station downtown. And as a result, you can see this temperature spike here. What's interesting is that when NASA went and adjusted the data and put in their homogenization scheme, it went down, as you can see. The past was cooler. This is the trend for the raw data. This is the trend for the homogenized data. And when you compare the two, you can see that not only did they not catch the temperature spike related to the move, but their own adjustments made the problem even worse. Another station, Miami, Arizona, at a copper mine. Interesting place, that black gravel all around it. It might be a factor, wouldn't you think? Turns out that that's not really gravel, that's mine tailings. And when you look at it from space, or from an aerial shot, you see the MMTS is surrounded by that black gravel. The albedo all around that station is pretty dark. Here's the temperature record. When do you think the station was moved there? It was moved there, and it was adjusted for. And the adjustments show this. That's what NASA did to that station after they adjusted for their homogenization scheme. We found a lot of rooftop weather stations. This one at the newspaper office in Santa Rosa, California was quite interesting. Right in a sea of air conditioners and black tar roof, downtown. We found them even as far east as Maine, in Baltimore on the rooftop there. This is a Weather Service station that is now closed, by the way. The Weather Service decided that it was no longer producing accurate readings. They actually produced a study that said, let's use this as an example of what not to do. And as you can see there, the over 100-degree maximas, they had 13 occasions where they had over 100 degrees on that rooftop station, and looking at the Baltimore ground station, the Baltimore airport, the DC airport, and 10 cooperative stations in the area, they had no over 100-degree readings. Probably a good move on the Weather Service's part to close that station. You've all heard of the Beverly Hillbillies. I present to you Granny's Weather Station. Cortland, New York, a homemade Stevenson Screen, discovered by Mr. Evan Jones right down here, one of our volunteer surveyors. And I looked at this and I said, what the hell were you thinking? Literally. I just couldn't believe it, because this was not anything close to any kind of a standard. We've got a makeshift Stevenson Screen on a rooftop with half of an MMTS inside of it. Notice that it's missing some of the plates. Anyway, these are the kinds of things that we found. We've also found stations where you can play basketball. We found stations where you can stand there and get warmed by the jet blast. That is an actual operating aircraft. That is not a museum relic. It's an actual operational aircraft. I checked. You can catch a train at this station. And this one here was in Georgia, which had a nice touch. It had an abandoned washer right next to it. We've got lots of automobiles. When you look at some of the sightings in infrared, you find some interesting things. This is a station in the middle of Kansas. I didn't put a label on here. I forget which city it was, but this is at the water treatment plant there. And you can see all those little glass blocks are like little mini greenhouses, and there's a lot of sun heating up that wall, which then, of course, would be radiated at night. This is in a guy's backyard in Livermore, California, and a private observer. That's his pool in the bottom of the photo there, and then his house is in the background. I pointed out to him that his house, this is over on an overcast day, by the way. There was no direct sun during this photograph. And I pointed out to him that he might want to check his insulation on his house a little bit. This one in Perry, Oklahoma, shows what happens when you get a wall that is in direct exposure of sunlight. This particular station here has also got convenient parking, as you can see in the lower right of the visible photo there. Vehicles parking literally within about 5 or 6 feet of it, and there's asphalt all around it. It's on a street corner. It's on an actual intersection of two streets out by the telephone pole. This one was taken right after a rain. This is at a sewage treatment plant in Fayetteville, and as you can see, even after a rain, the concrete retains a fair amount of heat. So we started evaluating all of these stations, and so we found some interesting things in the process. We borrowed some of the Weather Service's own rating criteria. The Climate Reference Network, we borrowed some of their rating criteria from that. It was based on some work by Michael Leroy of Meteo France, and had a simple 1 to 5 category rating, which made it easy for volunteers to get an idea of what was going on. So far, as of about Thursday of last week, we have surveyed 75% of the network, 75% of the 1,221 stations out there, and this is what the distribution looks like. On the left, you see all of the stations. On the right, you see the stations that we've surveyed. And here are the stations presented with the CRN rating. CRN rating of 5 is considered to be a very bad station, something you might find on a rooftop. CRN 1 is considered an excellent station, where the most close influence is at least 100 meters away. As you can see, there's not too much blue. There's a lot of yellow, a lot of orange, a lot of red. Here's how it breaks down. Out of all of those stations we surveyed, 919, only 11%, that's CRN1 plus CRN2, those are the two acceptable levels by the Weather Service's own standards. Only 11% meet the Weather Service's standards, whether you look at the CRN rating or whether you look at the simple 100-foot rule that NOAA has for their co-ops. The vast majority of the stations out there don't follow NOAA's own siting standards. We haven't done a whole lot of data analysis yet because I wanted to get to a majority of stations surveyed so that I could deflect any arguments that might come about associated with not having an adequate sample. And now having 75%, I can feel comfortable in talking about some of the data, and I'm just going to touch on it lightly here. As you can see, we've plotted the trends and error bars for the different classes of stations. And CRN1 has the least trend. The raw data from the CRN1 stations has the least trend. The adjusted FileNet data for CRN5 has the most trend. FileNet, for those of you that are not familiar with it, is basically a way for NOAA and NCDC to put weather data back in where it's missing. If the observer doesn't report data's missing, they take data from surrounding stations and do an interpolation and use it to fill in the missing data. And as you can see, there are some significant differences between CRN1 and CRN5. CRN2, on the other hand, has an interesting bump in it, and we think that has to do with airports. Most of the stations that are CRN2 are ASOS automated stations at airports which have been relocated into grassy areas. NOAA itself does its own adjustments to the data, which causes additional heating. We found this as a surprise. This is NOAA's own graph, 0.6 of a degree centigrade added to the record by NOAA's own adjustments. Here's the conclusions. Majority of them have class 4 ratings that are the new temperature system, the MMTS. A lot of cable issues are involved. The majority of stations have large errors, 1 or 2 degrees C, and almost 70 of them have water treatment plants and sewage plant issues. There's a lot of quality control lacking. There's lots of microsite biases that are not being caught. The adjustments to station records are actually adding to the problem. The magnitude of all of this may be actually greater than the AGW signal that we seek. Thank you.